Hey team, and welcome back to the channel. Today for this video I wanted to take a minute to talk to you about aspects. Specifically a sort of high-level dive into the mechanisms at work behind aspects. And this is really important no matter kind of what branch of astrology you tend to work with. For myself, being mainly focused in like horary and elections and magical elections, this is kind of how I think about aspects all the time. But even in natal astrology, you'll think about them very, very similarly, just with kind of slightly different symbolism. So before we get into sort of like the high level kind of breakdown of the mechanisms that are at work behind aspects, first we needed to kind of talk about the anatomy of an aspect itself. So what is an aspect? An aspect is just a geometric relationship between two planets. When two planets reach a certain amount of degrees apart, they take part in forming a leg of a shape, basically, against the sky. So, for instance, if two planets come to be about 60 degrees apart, well, then they start to form the shape of a hexagon. If two planets get 90 degrees apart, they start to form the shape of a square. If two planets get 120 degrees apart, they start to create the shape of a triangle. And then if they are 180 degrees apart, they make the shape of a line. And so it's these geometric shapes that provide a little bit of information about the aspect itself, kind of how it's going to happen, as well as planetary associations with the different aspects. So aspects are just relationships between two planets. And that's a really important point to dig into, because while we can kind of get kind of crazy thinking about aspects, they are just simply a relationship between planet A and planet B and how that is expressed at any given moment in time. So in an aspect, you will have a faster planet, sometimes this is called the lighter planet, who seeks to make the connection or to establish the aspect, basically, with the second planet, who is determined to be the heavier planet or the slower planet, who sort of either accepts or makes do with the aspectual relationship in some way. Planetary speed is very important here because this will determine who is kind of performing what part, and usually this follows the Chaldean order of the planets, with the moon as the fastest planet, who is able to apply to everybody, but nobody is able to apply to. Mercury is next, and then Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and then finally Saturn, who is the slowest planet, to whom nobody is able to, or to whom applies to nobody, but everybody is able to apply to Saturn. So once you have, determined the aspect type that's being formed, whether, a square or a conjunction or whatever, and you've identified the two planets that are involved, as well as figuring out which one is the faster planet and which one is the slower planet, this is where you really start to get into the interpretation of the aspect itself. And really the kind of secret behind aspects is this concept that is referred to as pushing. So pushing is basically the background mechanism that is occurring behind every aspect that determines what it's doing, how it's doing it, and whether or not that is going to be successful. Pushing is a concept that comes to us primarily from the Persian and Arabic astrologers, and it is an area of aspectual interpretation that has more or less fallen out in modern contemporary astrology. I've never read like a modern astrology book that talks about pushing or kind of conceptualizes aspects through this pushing model. But there are different kinds of pushing, but what we're going to focus on today is pushing management or pushing counsel. And this is a super important process that is occurring in aspects that needs to be paid more attention to in any situation, but especially when we're talking about horaries, magical elections, and mundane elections. Basically what happens is we have our lighter planet who is applying to our heavier planet. While this lighter planet is doing this application, it's understood that there's this pushing process occurring within this aspect. The idea is that the lighter planet, it has things attributed to it, it has significations, it has desires, it has stuff it wants to do and stuff it wants to accomplish. And as it makes this aspect to this other planet, it pushes or hands off those significations or desires to that heavier planet, who then gets to decide essentially what to do with it. They're now kind of like stuck with the responsibility of like taking care of this thing, but they have the freedom to do kind of whatever they want with it. So basically what this means is that a planet wants to do something, a lighter planet wants to do something, it hands over kind of the instruction manual to this heavier planet, who then gets to decide if they're going to like build the model or whatever the instruction manual covers. And at this point, this is where we get into like the checklist of determining whether or not an aspect is going to be successful. There's a whole list of considerations that an astrologer will run through to determine kind of what the outcome of this aspect is going to be, whether it's going to be, favorable and long lasting, or if it's going to be terrible and short, or terrible and long, I guess. And there's, like I said, there's a number of considerations that go into it. Partly it is the aspect type. Sextiles and trines generally are received more favorably than oppositions and squares, so that those aspects make it more likely that the issue is going to be resolved favorably. The nature of the planet that is being applied to plays a really big part in it. So, like, applications to Saturn tend to fail because Saturn doesn't want to do stuff. But applications to Jupiter tend to succeed because Jupiter does want to do things. Benefic planets tend to want to help the other planets out. Malefic planets tend to not want to get involved. But there's also like complications, I guess, or nuance, obviously, to it, to where the sign that the aspect is coming from makes a big deal, like has a really large impact on whether an aspect is accepted or not, based on the concept of planetary reception and planetary refusal. Basically, planets have authority over the signs that they do well in, their signs of dignity, and they tend to abhor things related to the signs that they do not do well in, their signs of debility. So, like Jupiter, who's already a pretty favorable planet, kind of wants to help everybody out and get things done, has a sense of responsibility or obligation to other planets that contact or aspect him through his signs of Sagittarius and Pisces. So, like the moon in Pisces applying a square to Jupiter is going to be more favorably received than a square through any other sign because Jupiter has an affinity for that sign. Whereas on the other hand, a square through to Jupiter with a planet in Virgo, where Jupiter does not do well in, is going to be refused. Like Jupiter's not going to want to do that because it comes from a place that Jupiter is uncomfortable with. And then a final consideration would be like planetary capability. And this is like an assessment of the heavier planet by itself to determine if it is even capable of doing the thing that needs to be done in the first place. And this is usually where things like, is it retrograde? That's bad. Is it combust? That's bad. Is it cadent? That's bad. Start to come into the conversation, because then it becomes less of, is this planet willing to take on this project? And more of a, does the planet have the skills necessary to complete this project? Like, your best friend might be really excited about helping you with your chemistry project, but if they have no familiarity with chemistry, how much help are they actually going to be in helping you to accomplish that kind of a thing? Like, do they have the skills necessary on top of the disposition or demeanor necessary to bring this to fulfillment? So it's a little bit of like a complicated judgment call, essentially, about whether or not an aspect will manifest appropriately, or whether or not it will, not manifest at all, or only manifest and hold itself together for a short amount of time. There's like a wide range of manifestations for any individual aspect. It's not just like a one and done kind of deal. But specifically when we're talking about it within the concept of like horary astrology, it becomes very important because these aspects, we're using them to determine whether or not whatever the querent is asking about is going to happen or not. So we tend to be like really, really scrutinizing about aspects the moon is making, especially, or aspects the ruler of the first house is making. Like, who is it applying to? Is that received favorably? How's that going to work out in this chart? Is that going to be enough to make what they are hoping for happen, essentially? But it also has a big part to play in elections and magical elections, where we're very concerned about the outcome of this venture or the effectiveness of this talisman, for which these kinds of pushing considerations are very important. So that's sort of like your crash course, I guess, within like the Persian Arabic concept of pushing, specifically pushing management or counsel. A lighter planet pushes what it wants to do, its itinerary essentially, onto a heavier planet, who then gets to decide or becomes like the manager in charge of that project. They have the freedom to say no to it. They have the freedom to fuck it up. They have the freedom to see it through to completion 100%. It all depends on the aspect involved, how that planet is approached, the disposition of that planet, whether or not it's benefic or malefic, and the reception or refusal involved, and that planet's capability as determined by various considerations regarding mostly like accidental dignities, like accidental fortitudes, and essential dignity to an extent, but generally more the accidental fortitudes are more important here. This Pusheen consideration is, of course, super important with the moon, who has kind of like her own job, her own special job within astrology. So the moon is really important, the most important planet in astrology, both in like a practical sense and kind of also in like a meta sense, in that the idea is philosophically, the moon helps to bridge the gap between us here in the physical world and the celestial world. This kind of division of the sublunar sphere and the superlunar sphere. Stuff above the moon and stuff below the moon. The moon works to translate down the influences of the other planets to the Earth, to help them kind of manifest in the Earth, to give them physicality, to take them from potential to actuality. So a lot of times when we're talking about like a horary chart or an election chart or a magical election, we focus a lot on what the moon is doing because that sets the tone for, the accomplishment of the question, or for what the election seeks to accomplish, or for the talisman itself. So we kind of are playing with this double lunar philosophy, I guess, to where the moon is the most important planet. She's the reason why astrology works down here in the physical world, and the planet that she applies to has a lot to say, has a lot of control over what that looks like to us and how that situation is going to manifest. Is her next aspect going to be to a positive planet, in which case we can imagine that there's going to be some sort of positive development, typically what we want, or is her next aspect going to be to a more difficult planet, and we can expect some sort of like difficulty or challenges coming up along the way, which is typically something that we want to avoid. So I wanted to sort of introduce this concept of, the moon's role in astrology philosophically and kind of mechanically, but also the concept of Pusheen counsel, partly because anybody who is studying horary or elections will get a lot of use out of that. Just kind of taking the step back to really dig into an aspect and interpret its likelihood of success based on this criteria of Pusheen. You'll get a lot out of it. It will not steer you wrong. But also because it helps to kind of explain how I think about or process magical elections for those of you in the audience who watch those videos of mine or otherwise follow my work in that area. The concept of like Pusheen management and the moon and lunar applications are like a huge filter through which I process talismans, their efficacy, their safety, anything in that area. So basically how this translates practically into like the creation of magical elections is that the moon's next aspect is going to be probably the most important one to determine how the talisman is going to work out, basically. So generally what you want to have happen in these kinds of magical elections is you want the moon to be able to apply to a planet. Her next application needs to be to a planet who, like I says, is able to do the business. And I use that sort of like more vague term because the planet that you'll go to, or sort of like the allowances that you'll accept, the planets that you'll accept as being the moon's next aspect, will change depending on what you are trying to accomplish with the talisman. So there are going to be talismans out there to where applications to Jupiter are going to be more preferred because Jupiter is a benefic planet. He wants to give and provide. So talismans that are focused on health, on wealth, on safety, on protection, tend to focus more on Jupiter because that's something that he's able to give. So generally you wouldn't want, like Saturn or Mars involved in talismans above related to those things because they are less capable of providing those things. It's just not really the skills that they are equipped with. But there might be situations where you do want to lean into a Mars or Saturn aspect. Maybe you're doing a talisman that's more for banishment or, something like that. In which case the more malefic energy is really more in line with what you're looking for. So you want to make sure that this aspect happens that the moon is applying to a planet who's capable of doing the business in regards to the topic or the intention of the talisman itself. When we're talking about like lunar mansion talismans, you have a lot of room here for judgment calls, for like a lot of room to interpretation or to make judgment calls about what you want the moon to apply to, because we don't really have like a guideline or like a filter so much through lunar mansion talismans. It really just becomes about lining up your intention with a planet who's capable of giving it to you, and this is something that like the Picatrix talks about a lot. Don't go to Mars for love talisman stuff. He's not like he doesn't know what to do with it. What the heck? Kind of that sort of thing. So a really great example, one that I've used before if you've seen some of my magical elections videos, is whenever I talk about elections that have to do with like the 12th or the 14th lunar mansion, those lunar mansions that are more about severing or separating or giving up something. Typically, I recommend these to people who are struggling to let go of failed relationships, whether that means, just kind of like stuck on somebody that you've broken up with, or it's broken up with you, or, or just kind of like in a bad relationship, but don't really have like the gumption to leave, just to be done with it, kind of a thing. Or somebody who's trying to break a bad habit or leave a work environment that they don't really care for anymore, but they're kind of afraid to leave, just any kind of thing like that. This is where we have a little bit more room to judge moon applications to the planet to see if we want to work with it. So what I usually do is I say that there are two different methods to accomplish this. You have your malefic method and your benefic method. So if you're someone who decided that you would prefer to have an application to like Venus or Jupiter in your 12th or 14th lunar mansion talisman, that can be fine. They're a little bit averse to the energy of the mansion. The mansion wants to separate and break things apart, but benefic planets like Jupiter and Venus kind of want to congeal things together. They want to keep things connected and together. So what can happen is these planets can make the talisman very safe, can make the talisman very like, you don't have to worry so much about like blowback or, big confrontations or, like concerns about safety are generally not an issue with benefic planets taking over the business, essentially. They'll do it their way. But the trade-off is that it might take a lot longer for the talisman to make it happen because these planets want things to stay together. So what will happen is it'll kind of like extend. It's sort of like ripping off a Band-Aid kind of slowly. You're kind of shared from that like sudden, and you're done with it. You're able to kind of maintain that contact and kind of break away from things more slowly and maybe more easily. But it can take a lot longer to get there, and maybe that's not the energy that you want. Malefic planets, on the other hand, if you chose to have like a Mars or Saturn connection, it's more just that we're done. It has a very like bridge burny, cutting ties, and maybe you do have that big kind of like flare-up confrontation or fight that is the reason why you leave. So I guess the thing is like benefic applications are more like putting in your 2 weeks notice. You'll get there eventually. You just have to kind of tough it out for a little bit longer, which can really suck depending on the work environment. Aspect with malefics are you just up and get like you just flip you just flip your desk and you leave, and that's it. Like you're done. There's no going back. But you've left yourself in a little bit of a bind, right? Like you're probably not going to be able to use that employer as a reference after that kind of a thing. So it really just depends on what the situation calls for, what your personality type is. Some people are much more like aggressive and really just want to be done with it, or just kind of how fed up you are. So there's a lot of room in there for a judgment call. And that's true with any lunar mansion, honestly. You could do that really with any lunar mansion. It's just going to change how easy it is for that mansion to make the thing happen. And how much you're willing to deal with that. Most lunar mansion charts are like judgment calls about whether the moon's application is effective for what you want to accomplish. I prefer them to be like 100% in line with what we want to accomplish, unless there's like some sort of nuance involved in it, such as like personal safety. If personal safety is a concern, then I'll probably always lean on benefic planets to shield it. So lunar mansions tend to have a lot of flexibility, a lot of room for judgment call for the astrologer to decide whether or not they want this particular aspect to this particular planet to play a big part, or to have a hand in, to have control over how the talisman manifests itself. You might not always want that. Sometimes you skip it. I know I do. But when we get to fixed star and planetary talismans, our guidelines are much stronger. We have much more strict guidelines because we actually have like guidelines at all, or some idea of what we should be doing. For planetary talismans, we have our most strict guideline when it comes to determining moon applications or which ones are acceptable. And for planetary talismans, 100% of the time, the moon should be applying to the planet the talisman is being made for. If you're going through all this trouble to, for an example, make Jupiter in Pisces, put him on the ascendant, have it be his day and hour, it seems like a very weird missed opportunity to not then also have the moon apply an aspect to Jupiter. Jupiter should be in the driver's seat for Jupiter talisman, and it's the moon's next aspect that puts him there. That's what Pusheen Council is all about, especially within the context of magical elections. The moon's next aspect determines which planet has the most say in filtering or manifesting that talisman in the real world around it, and there's not really a good reason to have like Mercury be the moon's next aspect in a Jupiter talisman. What good is Mercury going to do here? Like why is Mercury in control of the itinerary for a Jupiter talisman, for example? So this is where I guess planetary talismans get like very, very restrictive, because having that planet be in control of 100% of that chart is super important. because planetary talismans are much more rare, have a lot more considerations to them, and are much easier to kind of fuck up, basically. Fixed star talismans have similar kind of guidelines or kind of like railings to operate within, but here I think we have a small bit of flexibility depending on how we want to play it. So generally, fixed stars are associated with the nature of one or two planets. So you'll see like this star is of the nature of Mercury and Venus, or this star is of the nature of Mars and Jupiter or whatever. And so when you're making these talismans, it's important for the moon's next aspect to be to one of the planets that the star is said to be of its nature of. So, for example, if you were making a Spica talisman, it would be very important to have the moon's next aspect be to Mercury or Venus, planets that are said to have a similar nature as that star. If you're making like a Regulus talisman, for example, Jupiter and Mars would be the planets that you would want to prioritize. So I do think there are some exceptions here that you can argue. First is that there are some stars that have really strong solar qualities or characteristics to them, such as Regulus and Sirius, to where I think aspects to... I've had a lot of success with aspects to the Sun in Sirius and Regulus talismans, and recommend it if Mars or Jupiter aren't really available for whatever reason. Another one is that for the more malefic or more difficult stars, it might be fine to have the moon applied to a nicer or more gentle benefic planet than like one of the more malefic planets that stars of the nature of. Algol, for instance, is of the nature of Saturn and Mars. And while I think it is best practices, we'll say, to have the moon applied to Mars or Saturn in an Algol talisman to get as much like 100% Algol energy in your talisman. I also know that a lot of people have kind of like difficult experiences with that star, just because it's one of the more difficult ones. So I will sometimes recommend a talisman with the moon applying to a more benefic planet to kind of like soften its edges. So it's not a 100%, in my opinion, like an Algol talisman. It's not like Algol at her most Algolness. It's Algol through a filter that might be a little bit more palatable for the person to work with. And I think that's fine, just with the understanding that like that's not the star, in its own, like on its own terms, I guess is what I mean. It's not the star as a star would present itself. It's the star kind of putting on a mask of another planet to make it easier to work with. So it kind of just depends on how you want to kind of juggle that. And so it's kind of like that with also, you could apply that same logic also to planetary talismans. It might be better in some instances to have the moon applied to another planet, but generally for planetary talismans, you want that 100% kind of like pure planetary energy to connect with. So you usually don't have that like consideration for softening this planet or making this planet easier to work with. That's something that you should have been doing prior to the creation of a talisman if you have that planet kind of difficult in your own natal chart. So Pusheen Council is a super important mechanism that is playing out in every aspect, whether we are aware of it or not, that helps us to determine an aspect's success and how that aspect manifests. In horary and elections, it tells us a lot about the success of the enterprise that's being asked about or undertaken. In magical elections, it tells us a lot about how exactly a talisman is going to manifest in the world around us and whether that's going to be effective and kind of how long that will last. So we talked about it from like the quality side of it, from making sure the planets that the moon applies to lines up with the intention of the talisman in some way, whether that's the more flexible approach to like the lunar mansions, where as long as the planet is one that can conceivably do the job that the lunar mansion wants to accomplish. No Saturn applications, like no Saturn squares in third lunar mansion talismans for all good things. Saturn doesn't want to do good things, so that's not going to work out. To our more rigid guidelines of planetary talismans, where the planet that the talisman is being made for had better be the planet that the moon is applying to give it complete control over its talisman. We have kind of another side of the consideration as well, which is about planetary fitness, how well a planet is able to operate. And I think this is related to, very similar to the planet that can do the business. It's part of the conceptual kind of framework that I run through in assessing these aspects, because fitness to do the business means a couple of different things. It means, on the one hand, that the planet is of the proper disposition to agree to do the thing, has the proper skills kind of in general to accomplish the thing. Venus is the most fit to do love talismans. Mars is the most unfit for love talismans, kind of a thing, or any kind of relationship talisman. But the other side of the fitness is the planet's capability to do that thing. And this is where we start to kind of like X out planets who are debilitated in some major way. Typically, retrograde planets you don't want to have the moon apply to, combust planets you don't want to have the moon apply to, and usually cadent planets you don't want to have the moon apply to. But I tend to make exceptions for this a lot. Because I tend to think that cadency... Okay, so let me just kind of break it down about why you want to avoid these, and then you'll kind of understand why I tend to accept cadency when I don't accept the other two. So cadency is when a planet is in the 3rd, 6th, 9th, or 12th houses. So generally you don't want the moon to apply to planets that are in those houses, but you can go and look at my election charts, probably this past video, and I probably have the moon applying to a planet in a cadent house. But for me, cadency has more to do with timing. Cadency is more for long-term planning to me. So when you have a planet, the moon applying to a planet in an angular house, it's more about like this happens more quickly. Like this goes more fast. This goes more quickly. This wraps up itself more quickly. So if you're on like a tight timeline, for instance, you may not want to use a talisman that has the moon applied to a cadent planet. But if you're not on a tight timeline and you have sort of like the freedom to allow the talisman to do its thing, then I think the moon applying to a cadent planet is fine, because all that really means is like it drags on for a long time. Like the talisman takes a while to start up. And for me, I think that's fine. I'm not super bothered about like the time it takes for a talisman to work. I just want the talisman to work and for it to be, safe and effective. That's all I care about. So if I have to wait 10 years, then so be it. But I understand that like some things we can't wait 10 years, so we need to kind of like speed it up. But it's for the same reason why I tend not to pay as much attention to like the speed of the moon, but that's like a different thing that I've talked about before in the past. But the moon's application to retrograde or combust planets are a horse of a different color, because this isn't so much about like, yeah, it'll get done, it'll just take a long time. This is more like, that ain't happening. And we don't like that kind of energy. We don't like this it ain't happening kind of energy. So the reason why the moon applying to a retrograde planet is bad is probably for the reason why you think, just kind of like conceptualizing planetary motions. The moon is moving forward through the zodiac, applying to, we'll say Mars, for instance. But if Mars is retrograde, then he is technically also applying back to her. So it's almost like a ping pong kind of a situation where the moon, passes off her counsel, her management to Mars. She's like, here, you're in charge of this now. But then Mars is retrograde, so he's like, no, you. And he just kind of like pushes it back at her. And the moon's like, ah, like very confused. And typically we don't want that. That's bad. But there are instances where it's fine. Actually, I forgot to mention, this is actually a thing. It has a name. It's called returning, and typically we don't want it. But there are instances where returning is fine, primarily when the moon is well placed. So what happens in this situation, if like the moon is in Cancer or Taurus and she's, angular or something, the moon just is like, here, Mars, you take care of this. You're in charge of this now. And then Mars is retrograde. He's like, no, you, and bounces it back to her. And she's like, okay, fine. Yeah, I can do this. She has the capability to do it on her own. So that can be fine. It's more of like a bump in the road. Like things kind of like get bad, but then they kind of pull themselves together at the end. That's kind of how returning manifests. Sort of like a more literal example. It can be fine. Typically, it's not ideal, but it can be fine. Applying to a planet that's combust is generally not fine. Because it is the moon handing over the job to a planet who is completely overwhelmed, like burnt out, overwhelmed, at their wits' end, and the job just does not get done. That's the best way to think about it, because that's kind of literally what's happening with the planet anyway. Planets that are combust are overwhelmed by the sun and just kind of like incapable of operating at more than what they already have. So the last thing that they need is for the moon to come along and be like, hey, this is your job now. So that assignment, that project just gets like buried in the list of like 7 others that planet is not capable of working with right now, and it just never gets done. So combust planets are out. Retrograde planets are typically out unless the moon is very well placed, but generally you just want to avoid them anyway as a rule of thumb. And then cadent planets can be fine as long as you're willing to kind of wait for the results to happen. So there's sort of like your introduction, your crash course introduction into the concept of Pusheen counsel, how it operates in aspects, and how we use that, how I specifically use that, or conceptualize it as helping aspects to go, or helping to determine which aspects are worth investing magical elections into, and which ones are not worth investing magical elections into. Pusheen Council is not just something that happens in like magical elections or like an electional astrology. It is like the mechanism that is occurring behind every aspect. It's what is making an aspect work. So it's a really great framework or sort of like list of considerations to run through whenever you're interpreting any aspect. Which one is the faster planet? What is it that they want to give to the heavier planet? Can the heavier planet make it happen or not? And then like what is the likely outcome of that? So I definitely recommend kind of taking this list of considerations through, your next horary chart that you might practice with, the next magical election you might try to run, or even your own natal chart and how two planets are interacting and sort of like what areas of life are they kind of bartering with or kind of like putting on one another essentially, and how well does that end up being manifest in your own life. But thank you guys so much for watching today. Hopefully this has given you a little bit to think about and helped you prepare a little bit for making your own magical elections, for talismanic crafting, and I will see you guys next time.